The heater in my truck was blowing warm air, and I had 3 bags of groceries on the passenger seat. That was all I was thinking about getting home before the meatloaf ingredients got too cold. It was a Tuesday, gray and flat the way February gets in this part of Ohio, the kind of afternoon where the sky looks like a sheet of wet concrete. I pulled into the Sunoco on Route 9 to top off the tank, and that's when I saw my son's truck. I recognized it immediately. The blue F-150 with the cracked left tail light I'd been telling him to fix for 2 years. It was parked away from the pumps, off to the side near the air and water station, engine off. I almost kept going. Almost. Something made me look twice. He was inside, reclined in the driver's seat with his jacket pulled up over his shoulders like a blanket. At 2:30 in the afternoon, on a Tuesday, I pulled up next to him and sat there for a moment. He didn't move. I got out and knocked on the window. He startled awake, and when he turned and saw my face, something in him, some wall he'd been holding up, just came down all at once. I watched it happen through the glass. He unlocked the door. "Dad," he said. That was it. Just my name. But the way he said it, like he was a kid again and had been waiting for me to find him, told me everything I needed to know before he said another word. I got in the passenger side. The truck was cold. He hadn't been running the heat. I asked him how long he'd been there, and he said since the night before. He'd slept in his truck, in a gas station parking lot, in February, and hadn't called me. "What happened?" I said. He looked at his hands for a long time. Then he told me, "My son had been married for 4 years. I never trusted his wife the way a father wants to trust the woman his son chooses. I tried. I want to be fair about that. I genuinely tried. She was charming when she wanted to be, and she made my son smile in a way I hadn't seen since he was young. So I kept my mouth shut and I shook her hand at holidays, and I paid for half the wedding because that's what you do when you love your child." Her name was Renee. She was 32, worked part-time at a salon, and her mother, Diane, lived 40 minutes away in Dayton and called her daughter no less than 4 times a day. I know this because my son mentioned it once, casually, and I filed it away without comment. Diane had the kind of personality that fills a room and then keeps filling it until everyone else feels squeezed out. She'd been divorced twice, ran a small boutique that seemed to stay open on stubbornness alone, and had opinions about everything, including things she knew nothing about. From the beginning, Renee and Diane were a unit. Where one went, the other followed emotionally, if not physically. My son understood this, accommodated it, and told me once that it was just how Renee was raised, how she was wired. I nodded and said nothing. What I didn't know, what he had been hiding from me for almost 8 months, was that the wiring had started burning the whole house down. It started, he told me, about a year into the marriage. Small things at first. Renee handling the finances because, she said, she was better at it. My son agreeing because he worked long hours in IT and came home tired, and she seemed organized, and it felt like partnership. The joint account, the bills, the monthly budget, she took it over gradually, and he let her, and that felt normal to him at the time. Then her mother's boutique started struggling. I don't know if it was bad luck or bad management or both, but Diane needed money, and she needed it quietly. Renee started pulling from the joint account, small amounts at first, 200 here, 300 there. When my son asked, Renee said it was for groceries, for the electric bill, for car repairs. He believed her because he had no reason not to, and because the alternative that his wife was lying to his face was a thought he wasn't ready to hold. By the time he understood what was happening, they were nearly $40,000 in the hole. But that wasn't the worst part. 6 months before I found him in that parking lot, Renee had taken out a home equity loan against the house. The house my son owned, the house I had helped him put a down payment on 7 years ago, before Renee, before any of this. She had forged his signature on the application. She had done it while he was traveling for work, a 3-day conference in Chicago, and she had deposited the money, $62,000, into an account he didn't know existed, an account in her name and her mother's name. The money went to Diane's boutique, to back rent, to supply her debts, to what Renee described to her mother as keeping us afloat. The boutique did not stay afloat. It closed 11 weeks later. When my son came home from Chicago, he had no idea. When the loan paperwork arrived, Renee intercepted the mail, When the bank sent a follow-up notice, she deleted the email from his account before he saw it. She had his password. He'd given it to her voluntarily, 2 years earlier, because they were married and it hadn't occurred to him to protect himself from his own wife. He found out the way you find out about things you weren't supposed to find out, by accident. He was looking for a bill statement and clicked on the wrong folder. There was a PDF. He opened it. His name was on a loan he had never applied for, and the signature at the bottom looked like his but wasn't. He confronted her that night. She cried. She told him she'd done it to save her mother, that she'd planned to tell him that it was a temporary solution, that she was sorry. And then, when the crying didn't work the way she needed it to, she shifted. She told him that if he made this into something, if he went to the bank or an attorney or, God forbid, called his father, she would tell people he had been controlling her finances for years. She would tell them he had isolated her. She would tell them things that weren't true, and she would tell them to the right people. And he would spend the next year of his life explaining himself instead of getting answers. My son was 35 years old, and he was afraid of his wife. Not physically. I want to be clear about that. He wasn't afraid she would hurt him. He was afraid of the version of himself she would create and distribute to everyone he knew. He was afraid of his own reputation, of his coworkers and his neighbors and his friends hearing a story that had his name in it, but none of his truth. He had seen it happen to someone else once, a man at his office whose divorce turned into a public character assassination, and the fear of it had paralyzed him completely. So he said nothing. He went to work. He came home. He slept next to a woman he no longer trusted in a house that was no longer fully his. And he tried to figure out a way through it that didn't blow everything apart. Then, 2 weeks before I found him, she asked him to sign something new. She put the papers on the kitchen table one evening and said her attorney had drawn them up and they were just a formality. A financial protection agreement, she called it. It would consolidate their assets under a joint trust. She explained it quickly, casually, the way you explain something you don't want examined too closely. He started reading, and she touched his arm and said, "Honey, it's just paperwork. It protects both of us." He read it anyway. He read it twice, and then he read the section that would have given her sole authority to liquidate any jointly held asset, including the house, in the event of a separation, with a 60-day window before he could legally contest. He put down the pen. She asked why he'd stopped. He said he needed more time to look it over. That night, she called her mother. He heard the conversation through the wall. He didn't hear every word, but he heard enough. The tone of it, the urgency of it, the phrase "he's not going to sign." Spoken not with sadness, but with a problem-solving kind of frustration. The way you talk about an obstacle. He left the next morning before she woke up. He drove around for 3 hours. He didn't know where to go. He couldn't go to a friend's house because she'd already spent months, he understood this now, in hindsight quietly reshaping what his friends thought of him. Small comments, subtle rewrites. He didn't know who believed what anymore. He couldn't go to a hotel because his credit card was nearly maxed from the debt she'd run up in their joint name. He ended up at a gas station on Route 9. And he parked, and he stayed, because he didn't know what else to do. He told me all of this in the cold cab of his truck, and I listened without interrupting. I am 63 years old. I built a contracting business from a pickup truck and a set of hand tools, and I have been in enough difficult situations to know that how you respond in the first 5 minutes matters more than almost anything else. So I waited until he was finished. Then I asked him one question. "Did you keep anything? Any documents? Any records? Anything at all?" He looked at me. "I have the original loan notice. The one she didn't intercept. I found it in a coat pocket." I said, "That's enough to start. I need to tell you about Frank, because Frank is the reason any of what came next was possible." Frank Delacroix had been my friend for 31 years. We met when he did the contract work on my business incorporation, back when I was just getting started and he was a young attorney trying to build his own practice. We had lunch every few months. I had been at his daughter's graduation. He had been at my wife's funeral. Some friendships are built over years, and some are built over shared weight, and ours was both. Frank had retired from active practice 2 years earlier, but he still knew everyone in the county legal community, and he still had a mind that moved like a searchlight, slow, deliberate, and impossible to hide from. I called him from the parking lot while my son waited inside the Sunoco buying coffee. I told him what I knew. I kept it brief. Frank asked 3 questions, paused, and then said, "Bring me the loan document tonight. Don't let the boy sign anything, and don't let him go back to that house alone." That night, the 3 of us sat at Frank's kitchen table. He looked at the loan document for a long time without speaking. Then he said the forged signature, if provable, was not just a civil matter. It was bank fraud. He said the money transferred to Diane's account, if traceable, would implicate both of them. He said the key was documentation, finding the financial trail before it got cleaned up. "They don't know what you know yet," Frank told my son. "That's your advantage. Don't throw it away." My son asked what to do. Frank said, "Go back. Act normal. Buy time. Don't confront. Don't accuse. Don't give any signal that anything has changed. Let them think the delay on the signature is just hesitation. Meanwhile, we work." I watched my son process this. He was exhausted and scared, and I could see him wanting to just blow the whole thing open, say everything out loud, let the damage land wherever it landed. That impulse made sense to me. But Frank was right, and I told him so. "Trust the process," I said, "not the feeling." He nodded. The next 3 weeks were the quietest war I have ever been part of. My son went back to the house. He cooked dinners and watched television and answered Renee's questions about work in the same flat, tired voice he'd been using for months, and she apparently noticed nothing different. Or she pretended not to. I've never been sure which. Meanwhile, Frank reached out to a contact at the county recorder's office and confirmed that the home equity loan had been filed and recorded. The signature on file was my son's name, but Frank had a handwriting analyst friend, retired forensic examiner, look at a copy alongside genuine samples. Her assessment, in writing, was that the loan signature showed significant inconsistencies with my son's natural signing pattern, not conclusive on its own. Enough to push forward. The bank was a different matter. Banks don't give information easily, and they shouldn't. But Frank found a former colleague who now worked in compliance at the regional branch that held the loan. He didn't ask for anything improper, just a conversation. What he learned, through appropriate channels, was that the loan application had been processed by a single branch employee who had since been terminated for an unrelated procedural violation. This mattered because it meant the due diligence on the application had been incomplete. The bank had its own exposure here, which changed the dynamic. Her name was Carol, the compliance officer. She was meticulous and careful, and she called Frank back 4 days later to say she'd reviewed the application file, and there were several irregularities she was obligated to report internally. She didn't share the specifics with Frank because she couldn't, but the fact that she called back at all told us the bank was now looking at this too. Then my son found the second account. He wasn't looking for it. He was searching for something in the email account. They shared a receipt he needed for a work reimbursement when he came across a forwarded confirmation from a financial institution he didn't recognize. He screenshotted it, closed the tab, and texted it to me with a single word: "Found something." It was a transfer confirmation from the joint home equity funds to an account at a different bank. The account holder name on the confirmation was Diane, not Renee. Diane directly. The amount was $38,000, wired in 2 separate installments 3 days apart. Frank's response when I forwarded it to him was 3 words: "Now we move." My son hired an attorney. A real one, not Frank. Frank's retirement was genuine, and he understood his role was guidance, not representation. The attorney was a woman named Patricia Hale, who specialized in financial litigation and had, according to Frank, the most organized mind he had encountered in 40 years of practice. She reviewed everything in a single 2-hour meeting and told my son, calmly and without drama, that what had been done to him was not a gray area. It was fraud. The forgery alone was a felony. The fund transfers to Diane, with documentation, established a conspiracy, and the agreement Renee had tried to get him to sign, the one he'd refused at the kitchen table, would have made recovering anything significantly harder. Someone, Patricia said, looking at my son over the top of her glasses, knew exactly what they were doing. The legal process was not fast. I want to be honest about that. It was 4 months of documentation and filings, and one genuinely unpleasant week when Renee, apparently realizing something was happening, did exactly what she had threatened to do. She called mutual friends. She posted things. She described my son in terms that I won't repeat here because they were the opposite of everything I know him to be. It was a painful week. My son called me every night. I told him the same thing every night. Stay quiet, stay focused, let Patricia do her work. The story Renee was telling needed no response from us. The documents would respond. The bank records would respond. The forensic handwriting report would respond. We did not need to win the argument. We needed to win the case. Here is what I know about people who build stories out of lies. The stories have to keep growing to stay standing. Every new version has to cover the gaps in the last version. And eventually, if you wait long enough and document carefully enough, the architecture collapses under its own weight. Renee's version collapsed in the 6th month. The deposition was a Tuesday morning, which feels fitting given how all of this started on a Tuesday. My son's attorney had requested Diane's financial records as part of the discovery process, and Diane's own attorney, a man who looked increasingly unhappy as the case developed, had spent 3 weeks attempting to limit the scope of what could be requested. He was not successful. The records showed everything. The 2 wire transfers from the home equity account. A third transfer I didn't know about, smaller, $8,000, wired a full month before the loan was even recorded, which suggested the planning had started earlier than we thought. Business payments made from Diane's account to boutique suppliers that matched almost exactly the timing of the joint account withdrawals Renee had been making throughout the marriage. 4 weeks later, Renee's attorney contacted Patricia Hale and asked about settlement options. Patricia told me later she had known this call was coming. She said people who commit financial fraud are rarely prepared for the forensic accounting stage. They think the money moves are complicated enough to be confusing. They rarely are. The settlement negotiation took 6 weeks. I will not detail every piece of it because some of it is my son's story to tell in his own time, but I will tell you the result. The fraudulent home equity loan was declared void by the issuing bank, which had completed its own internal investigation and had, as Frank predicted, significant motivation to resolve the matter cleanly. The funds transferred to Diane's account were subject to civil recovery proceedings. The house remained in my son's name. Renee and Diane both faced criminal referrals from the bank's fraud unit. I do not know the precise status of those proceedings as I tell you this, because these things move slowly and I am trying to be accurate rather than dramatic. What I know is that the referrals were made, that the documentation was substantial, and that 2 attorneys who spent months trying to complicate a straightforward case eventually ran out of complications. My son moved back into his house in October. He changed the locks the same afternoon, which is something Patricia specifically suggested and which I thought showed good judgment on her part. He called me when he got inside and said, "I'm home, Dad." I was sitting in my truck in my own driveway when he called, for no particular reason, and I stayed there for a while after we hung up and watched the streetlight come on. I want to say one thing about the months when my son was silent, when he was carrying this alone and sleeping in parking lots and trying to figure out how to protect himself from someone he'd trusted completely. I have thought about this a great deal since. He didn't call me because he was ashamed, not of what she had done to him, but of the fact that he had let it go on, had not seen it sooner, had given his password and his finances and a portion of his self-trust to someone who was using them against him. He thought telling me would mean I saw him as someone who had failed to protect his own life. I need you to understand something. If you are watching this and you are in the middle of something like this, if there is something in your life that you are carrying alone because you are afraid of what it means about you, the people who love you are not keeping score. Your failures of trust and judgment are not what we remember. We remember the Tuesday afternoon we knocked on the truck window. We remember hearing your voice say our name. We remember that you were still there. That's all we needed. There is something about that Tuesday in February that I keep returning to. The gray light, the empty parking lot, the way he looked when he turned and saw me through the window, not surprised, exactly, but relieved in a way that ran deeper than the cold. I have thought sometimes about what would have happened if I hadn't stopped for gas, if I'd driven past, if I'd been coming from a different direction. My son is not the kind of man who would have stayed in that parking lot forever. He would have figured something out eventually. He's built like that underneath the fear and the exhaustion. There's a steadiness in him that I recognize because it's the same thing I saw in his mother. He would have found his way back to himself with or without me, but I'm glad I stopped. I think about Samuel from the book of 1 Samuel, a man who listened when others weren't sure there was anything to hear, I think about Frank, who has known me for 3 decades and picked up the phone on the first ring. I think about Patricia Hale, who sat across from my son in a conference room and told him the truth plainly and without softening it. I think about Carol at the bank compliance office, who called back because it was the right thing to do, even when it was the harder thing. There are people in this world who will help you if you give them the chance, not because they owe you anything, but because they understand that doing the right thing when it costs you something is what separates a good person from a convenient one. I am 63 years old. I have buried my wife, built and lost and rebuilt a business, and watched my only child walk into a marriage I had quiet doubts about and never voiced. I have made mistakes I would unmake if I could and kept silences I should have broken earlier. What I know is this: the truth has better endurance than the lie. Every lie requires maintenance. The truth just sits there and waits. They thought they had built something airtight. They had spent months constructing it, the documents, the transfers, the narrative about my son that they distributed to anyone who would listen. They thought they had covered every angle. They had not counted on a cracked tail light and a Tuesday afternoon and a father who decided to stop for gas. If you have ever had to fight for someone you love, you know it changes you. Not the fighting, the decision to fight. The moment when you look at what's in front of you and you say, not this, not my child, not on my watch. I drove away from Frank's house that first night with my son following behind me in his truck, his headlights in my rearview mirror all the way home. I made up the guest room. I put a blanket on the end of the bed the way his mother used to do. He ate 2 plates of the meatloaf that had been sitting in the refrigerator since Tuesday, and I sat in the chair by the kitchen door, the way I used to sit up when he was 17, and I was waiting for the sound of his key in the lock, listening for his breathing to even out down the hall, waiting until the house was quiet. Some things don't change. Some things shouldn't. If you're listening to this from somewhere across this country, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight for someone you love? Have you ever been the one who needed to be found? Leave a comment below, tell me where you're watching from, and tell me your story. Because I think you'd be surprised how many people out here are sitting in parking lots right now, waiting for someone to knock on the window. Don't make them wait too long.